All right, we are ready for our second panel today, and the panel will be dedicated to climate and growth, the road to a green recovery. Let me introduce also with the walk-in, so the gallery can start with that. And the panel discussion will be animated by Camilla Bausch, Director of Ecological Institute in Germany, and then we will have connected from outside Bill Thomas, who's CEO of KPMG. But to introduce the session, let me introduce also the video address and the message that we are honored to have from Patricia Espinosa, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Thank you for your kind invitation to say a few words at this important gathering. I know full well the amount of effort that goes into summits such as this one. So let me first thank and acknowledge all the hard work put in by the summit organizers and co-chairs, ISPI and Bocconi University. Dear colleagues, COP26 in Glasgow will begin in just 3 weeks' time, and I have been asked to speak about whether the time is ripe to achieve an ambitious result. The short answer to that is absolutely yes. The world has no alternative but to make it a success. This COP is nothing less than a credibility test for global efforts to address climate change. So, what will success in Glasgow look like? I will break it down into 4 steps. First, it is vital that parties fulfill their pre-2020 commitments. Doing so will be a key factor in the ultimate success of our deliberations. To that end, a roundtable on the pre-2020 agenda will be held at the conference. A central discussion point at the COP will be the provision of financial support to developing countries, especially in relation to the goal of mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020. That pledge was made over 10 years ago. It's time to deliver in full. We need to see the pathway. And of course, we continue to call upon all nations to submit more ambitious and higher quality NDCs. The relevant discussion at COP26, informed by our most recent synthesis report, must provide a positive signal that the world is determined to transition towards a low-carbon future. The current report clearly shows we are on the wrong trajectory, and COP26 must be where nations first show their willingness to turn things around. We are simply out of time to do anything otherwise. It's time for concrete action, to back up aspirational speeches. Second, it's also time to wrap up outstanding negotiations and actually implement the Paris Agreement. And that includes resolving the complicated issue of Article 6 on carbon pricing. We cannot keep pushing this from COP to COP. It's time for bold and courageous decisions by parties on this issue, as well as several others. For example, parties must ensure the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement is consistent with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. They must also advance work in areas related to adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage. The Paris Agreement established a global goal on adaptation to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability to climate change. At COP26, parties should agree on how to assess progress towards achieving this goal. Technical issues may not capture the headlines, but they are crucial, absolutely central to whether the world implements the Paris Agreement and gets off our current path of destruction. In short, the details matter. Third, success also means countries committing to do much more on all key aspects of the climate agenda: mitigation, adaptation, and support to developing countries. For example, on mitigation, we need clear plans. That includes national plans aligned with science and long-term strategies that can get us to climate neutrality by 2050. We continue to call for 50% of the total share of climate finance provided by all developed countries and multilateral development banks to be allocated to adaptation and resilience. And we need wider ranging and comprehensive financial support for developing nations. On the private sector side, we call upon all businesses and investors to align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to do so by 2024. Finally, and perhaps most critically, success means ensuring that no voices remain unheard, nor viable proposals left on the table. In this regard, the work of our partners, including the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience coalitions, among others, have been exceptional. The power and influence of such impressive teams of cities, regions, businesses, investors, and educational institutions from all over the world have been equally remarkable. This is inclusive multilateralism at its finest and remains fundamental to reaching our climate goals. So there you have the 4 steps required for us to declare COP26 a success. It won't be easy. The issues are technical, complex, and difficult to solve, but they cannot be allowed to become obstacles, much less excuses, that prevent us from achieving the overall goals already agreed to by the signatories to the Paris Agreement. The time has come for leaders to compromise. Just as with COVID, nations cannot wall themselves off from the ravages of climate change. It is imperative that leaders engage in frank discussions that transcend their own national interests, but rather look to the needs of all. I remain hopeful. Countless thousands of state and non-state actors alike are working incredibly hard to get all sectors of society, public, private, and civil society, to take the necessary action required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by mid-century. We cannot let these efforts go to waste. The next step is for parties at COP26 to show the bold and courageous leadership billions throughout the world expect of them. We cannot let them down. I thank you for your leadership and look forward to working with you to achieve a clean, green, sustainable future for all people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it was a privilege having Patricia Espinosa insights ahead of the COP26. She's been working so hard to get to some fruitful results in the meeting that will take place in Glasgow. But Camilla Bausch, let me get to the real agenda of the COP26, which is based on how to make the Paris Agreement targets reachable. From, if we take all the government pledges, even if they were fully achieved, they would fall well short of providing us the condition to reduce carbon emission to zero by 2050 or to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So my first question is, do you think there's still a chance to get to those targets? Are they still achievable?
So thank you very much for this question. And the good thing is that I can answer with a yes. If there's a chance, yes, there's a chance. And to make this chance reality, I think we have to show, as a world community, determination, courage, and compassion. So let's have a quick look. What do we want to achieve and where are we at? So in Paris in 2015, we basically said, let's strive to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius with the aim of limiting it actually to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we look at the situation we are right in, and you said with all the pledges on the table, assuming they will be fulfilled, are we on track? No, we are not. We are still above 2 degrees Celsius if you take the trajectory of the targets put on the table, despite some encouraging trends lately with an increased ambition by some countries. So now, since we're at a T20 summit, one has to look at the G20 and just admit that G20 are responsible for 75% roughly of global emissions, so their action is key. So what do they have to bring to the Glasgow Climate Summit? They have to bring their national climate commitments, which are ambitious and improved compared to their ambitions, let's say 5 years ago. Are they so? Only for some. So I think one thing one can say, that it is good, for example, for Europe to progress with their targets and put them on the table, submit them to Patricia Espinosa, but all G20 countries actually have to live up to that, and some do not, and some have even reduced their ambition. That is, I think, at this point in time, not acceptable. The other thing is, and I think that links nicely to what we just heard with respect to Greta Thunberg referring to the blah, blah, blah. The targets have to be backed by implementation efforts, and this affects agro-food systems, industries, our housing. But let's just look quickly at one aspect of energy, as energy, the energy sector is the biggest emitter. And if you look there at coal, there is the clear challenge to the world to phase out coal. Industrialized countries have to do so more quickly than developing economies, but we have to phase out coal. And there's also a clear claim there should not be new investment in coal. Some say in unabated coal. And the good thing is that China actually just said with respect to international funding that it will pull out of international funding of unabated coal. So that's a good sign. That should be across the world something we should take serious. And since we're at Bocconi University, thank you for hosting this. I also have to mention, for the future, we need knowledge systems which enable us to educate, to inform all the change agents we want to see in a way that they can actually implement the transformation we need to engage in. And I think there's quite a bit still to do.
That's great. And this has been, please. And phasing out coal has been largely debated, also the pre-COP level here, and apparently China is moving this time in the right direction. We shall see. Then there's the point of subsidies of fossil fuels, but we'll have more on this later, because there's also a financial aspect which is connected with the involvement in this process of the private sector. And with this, I want to move to Bill Thomas, that should be already connected, and with us from the outside. Here we go. Welcome, Bill Thomas. It's a pleasure having you.
And my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We were mentioning the role that the private sector will have in the green and just transition. It also is about funding. Here in Milan, Mario Draghi said this is the economic distribution transition. Climate transition has a lot to do with that. How do you see the chance, and what's the best way to mobilize capital and private capital in project that goes in this direction in your experience?
Well, Juan, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think this is a really important discussion and a great question. So, I'll start with there's more than enough capital like available between the banks, the investors, global corporations. But your question is right. What's holding that back? And I think that there's certainly many reasons for this, but I truly believe that one of them is due to a lack of transparency, because ESG reporting, for example, is just very much still in its infancy. And if you think about it, there's an information gap that I think is holding it back. And right now, companies, they're not very transparent about the impacts, both positive and negative, that their businesses have on people and the planet. For example, as we just heard, many companies have net zero commitments, but they don't share much about the how that they're going to accomplish that goal. And without that information, you've got banks and investors that don't have a great understanding of the risks, and it definitely prevents them from providing sort of more capital to finance the transition. So certainly, we all know better information, it frees up that capital. Better information on the issues that we all want to fix, that's going to be critical. And I think with better, transparent ESG reporting, then you've got banks and investors. They've got the information they need to make the decisions, deploy the capital where it's needed. So it's comparable, it's transparent. And I think decisions can be made. And then that capital helps us achieve a much more sustainable and a fair economy much quicker. And these reporting standards and the quality, the data quality, standards that Vittorio talked about, that like they're definitely needed, and I think all of us are aware the IFRS Foundation initiative to establish the International Sustainability Standards Board. I mean, that's a great step forward. The work of the World Economic Forum, which all of us at KPMG worked on, along with the other big four firms, on the stakeholder capital metrics. I mean, that's being adopted by an ever-growing number of major multinational corporates around the world as just kind of an interim step to a global standard, which is ultimately what we all want and need. And I think, you just referenced it. I mean, developing countries, they pose like just a whole another level of challenge, because the barriers there are even greater. So reliable information, less mature capital markets, the shortage of technical capability, like all of these things create significant barriers to the flow of finance. And the work that His Royal Highness Prince Charles and his Sustainable Markets Initiative is doing, that's really seeking to solve some of these challenges by working with multinational companies, the multilateral development banks, the developing market governments, everybody working together to really find a way forward. And one solution that's being talked about there is really an international project development tool that allows for better flow of information between sponsors of the sustainable projects as well as the providers of the finance, and that's got to be in everybody's objective. And then finally, I think there's more that individual companies can do to try and drive the demand, and we see green energy technology as a key ingredient to the transition towards a more sustainable future. Multinational corporations like ours, every one of us has a key role to play in helping to drive that innovation by working with the green tech startups, allowing their solutions to scale much more quickly than they would have otherwise. And I think we also have an opportunity to put our money where our mouth is and purchase energy from new renewable sources, especially again in developing markets where we can support the transition away from carbon-based energy. But so look, I'll stop there. There's not one solution. There's a number, but there certainly is lots that the private sector can and should be doing to achieve it.
Well, thank you so much, Bill Thomas. I think that you touched an incredibly important point, because everyone who's working in the financial sector knows how badly we need to accelerate in creating global standard when it comes to assess climate risk, report climate risk, manage climate risk, trillions of private investment will be needed to fill the gap between what it takes for a green transition and what public investment can do. But the private sector needs clear rules. And today, you name it, there's a jungle of different methodology. And you mentioned what's the forum in Davos is starting to do, the World Economic Forum. But this is just one of the initiatives. So this is at the global level. The G20 will have to say something about that, because it all comes down also to financial flows. What are your expectations in terms of how to finance this green and just transition? Because we never have to forget the social implication of all the measures that are connected to the ecological transition.
That's a huge question, and it's an important question. Let's link it quickly to the Glasgow summit again. So if we think of financial flows in the context of the Glasgow summit, we think of this 100 billion already mentioned by Patricia Espinosa. So in 2009 in Copenhagen, when industrialized countries basically promised to mobilize in public and private funding this 100 billion to support developing countries in both mitigation and adaptation needs. Now, where are we at the moment? That is very difficult to assess because, first, there is no robust data to really give a clear answer, and second, there is not an agreed methodology to do so. But if you look at the analysis which has been done so far, despite of these insecurities, it seems that we are definitely not delivering as industrialized countries what has been promised. Looking at, for example, an analysis by OECD, we heard today Luis de Mello and of the OECD. So the OECD looked at it and said for 2019, there were 80 billion of financial flows mobilized. So obviously that's 20% short, and the expectation is that 2020 will not have been much better. So how do we deal with that in this context of negotiations? That's a challenge. That's a big topic because it's a question of trust. And it's a question of really supporting the opportunities there are. And you can also link it to the Sustainable Development Goals, access to clean energy. We actually want to make this happen. So that will be an important point to negotiate. By the way, one of the two co-facilitators in this context is German. Germany has actually raised its pledges. The US has done so just recently, or promised to approach Congress in this context. So I think this dynamic has to grow, and we have to transfer it in a better way, as just has mentioned, also to mobilize private funding, and that is not only about money, but also connected to frameworks. Having said this, thinking of financial flows, it's not only about this 100 billion, but it's also about what do we finance. It has been elaborated just now. We do still finance a lot of industries of the past. We have to go more into the industries of tomorrow, of the future, which are sustainable for the planet and for the economy. And if you look at that, it's quite interesting if the IEA and the IMF, not revolutionary green organizations, find that investing right now in something like solar PV or in sustainable urban mobility infrastructure or efficiency, it actually creates more than twice the jobs created by investments in coal or gas. So I think also from recovery point of view, it's really good to go that way. And then again, you can link it to knowledge systems which are needed to then also buffer social transitions, because jobs will be lost even though more jobs will be created. Those who lose the jobs need an answer to their situation. And you have to think about cost, but then think also, please, about Sir Nicholas Stern, to stay with the UK. You just mentioned the Prince, so I've mentioned Sir Nicholas Stern, who has said already long ago, accumulating a lot of research around the cost of action and inaction, that the cost of action is much lower than the cost of inaction. So it's actually a good business case to invest, and we should do that.
Absolutely. This is what also John Kerry came here to Milan to the pre-COP to say, that the ecological transition is an economic opportunity. After all, we have to manage it in the proper way, as you were saying. Now, this has also many different dimensions that are strictly interconnected, because when we talk about climate change, we also talk about the changes of our food systems, the health of the planet and the health of human race here, and also biodiversity. This is why it's so relevant to hear today also the voice of the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Dr. Ku Dong-yu, who sent us this video message to the T20.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time of a great opportunity to face the great challenge of making our agri-food system fit for the purpose, now and for the future generations. Transformation to more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems is important to achieve the food security, mitigate risks, and support the biodiversity conservation, and address the economic crisis. Key high-level international meetings during 2021, such as the UN Food Summit, COP15 in October, and COP26 in November, provide a global opportunity for advancing the solutions and funding needed to strengthen the role of the sustainable ecosystems in helping us to achieve our development, climate crisis, and biodiversity goals. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021 to 2030, called by the FAO and the UNEP, is an opportunity for engagement and upscaling ecosystem restoration at a wide scale of the next decade. Sustainably scaling up circular bioeconomies can address the issues of agri-food waste, provide opportunity for employment, diversify revenue resources, and provide clean energy. And the private sector has a major role to play. FAO has been increasingly engaging with the private sector in building the partnership with wheat clusters and other agribusiness institutions in Central Asia to restore the productive landscape. Dear colleagues, green response and better recovery from the COVID-19 is imperative. Let's walk the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ku Dong-yu, who's Secretary General at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And with this, I go to my final question to Bill Thomas, if he's still there. And Bill, the International Energy Agency in May presented a kind of a milestone special report, which was called Net Zero by 2050. And well, basically that was the first comprehensive roadmap to get where we want to go with all the measures. And the good news inside that was that the technology actually are there, and innovation is pushing in this direction, from carbon capture to all a new generation of climate geoengineering technology that are still in a very early stage. But they need also that private sector and investments push in this direction. What are the main strategies that internationally can be followed to sustain this effort towards innovation in all the technologies that will be needed?
Well, thanks for that. And I do think there are a number of measures that could be introduced by policymakers to do this. And I think, I mean, as you said, I mean, scaling this, the change we need is the biggest obstacle in securing, I think, what is the future that we all want. And so you're right, there is decisive collective action that all of us need to undertake. So I think we do now more than ever need to act together. Governments and businesses need to act together. The business, as you've said, it's awash with talent, innovation, and money. And there is the expertise and the foundations to make a difference. So there is the technology. We have the tools. We have the technology to build a more sustainable future. But for that to work, we truly need, I think, bold decisions, brave decisions that work in tandem with, I think, much greater public-private collaboration. So private enterprise, it can only go so far. We need governments to take more kind of uncertainty out of the equation. And if the global pandemic taught us one thing, it is just how effective international cooperation combined with a collective sense of urgency when we really want it to be, how effective that can be in many regards. It's not perfect, but it can be. And I think just as COVID taught us, I mean, it needs sustained government intervention to manage this going forward. The climate crisis is only going to be managed with sustained government intervention. And if you want three sort of key actions that I would throw out there as a starter to accelerate this, I think three of them would be as follows. One, as you heard from Camilla right now, like eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, cutting tariffs on climate-friendly goods, and really developing, I think, market-based, meaningful, and broadly accepted carbon pricing mechanisms, which I think that latter point definitely needs to be done with an escalating carbon price, so that will enable greater competitiveness of low carbon technologies. And if we do that with international cooperation on a global connected carbon market, we do that to sort of make sure that we control leakage. So there's one where you sort of get rid of the disincentives and enhance the incentives. Secondly is really one about how do we support and protect the first movers. So especially in the areas of scaling existing proven solutions and technology across a value chain, and to do that, in the near term here, and especially in carbon intensive sectors, and for the development of new technologies for carbon removals. Because I agree we have the technology, but let's face it, that technology is only going to get better and better and better as time goes on. And then lastly, I think we've got to invest in climate adaptation. So creating resilient cities, looking at supply chains and infrastructure by scaling natural disaster defenses. And you mentioned Secretary Kerry and some of the conversations that he's having in that regard. And I think really advancing climate resilient, sustainable food production like we just talked about, and water supply. So look, these steps will focus our energy, focus our time, focus our efforts and our money, and really helping businesses plan and build towards concrete goals. They do eliminate uncertainties, and every time you eliminate uncertainty, you allow business to move at a much faster pace with more collective action. And the time for collective, decisive action that all of us need to take and can take is clearly right now, as we've all heard.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Bill Thomas. And thanks also, Camilla Bausch, because ladies and gentlemen, now I think it's time to introduce the T20 policy recommendation from the task force that has been working on climate change, sustainable energy, and environment. Well, it's time for the closing remark of this session, and so I invite to join us on the stage Luigi Mattiolo. Ambassador Mattiolo is G20 Sherpa of Italy.
I'm here, connected.
Okay, connected. I thought you were
hope
here.
you can
Okay,
hear me.
thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and let me really thank all of you for participating and engaging on such a crucial debate on climate and growth. It's also a pleasure, an opportunity for me to thank all the organizers, in particular ISPI or ISPI, and Giampiero Massolo and all his staff, his team, for supporting the Italian G20 presidency throughout this important year. As the complexity of global challenges grows, so too does the need for a responsible and effective G20. In this context, and given the complexity of the issues at hand, the role of the T20 and of other engagement groups is increasingly important. We are reminded, I would say, on a daily basis of the need for global cooperation in our interconnected world. This is nowhere as evident as in the case of our common fight against the existential threat of climate change. With the Paris Agreement, we converged on the importance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels. The actions we have taken to date are insufficient indeed. Under current policies, we are set to exceed 3 degrees of global warming. If these were to occur, the consequences would be catastrophic for ourselves, for our way of life, and most importantly, for all of our children, for all next generations. We must act faster and much more effectively. As a G20 presidency and co-chair of the COP26 with the United Kingdom, we have placed safeguarding our planet at the heart of our program of work. All countries have to do their own part, but it's clear that the members of the G20 are required to show leadership and have a special role to play. Together, our countries make up almost 80% of global GDP and over 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, the G20 only exists in its current form because of its perceived capacity to address global systemic crises. The world is now looking to us for a decisive contribution to the climate crisis, whose ramifications are set to extend deeply into each of our lives if we do not act now. During the course of the year, G20 members have agreed that our actions in addressing this crisis should be guided by the best available science. The truth is that we only have two options ahead of us. The first is to face the cost of the transition now, coming together and working towards a shared objective. This will require big efforts, but it will also generate new jobs, as Minister Colau was recalling, and create more sustainable economies. The alternative is to act at a later stage and pay the far vaster price for inaction in the face of a climate disaster with far-reaching, unpredictable, and I'm afraid irreversible consequences on critical issues such as water availability, food production system around the world. Based on such premises, it is easy to see that the ecological transition is not a choice, it is a real necessity. The decisions we take this year at the G20 as well as the COP26 will be critical in assuring that we take the road towards a green recovery. The world is still struggling with the pandemic, which has cost millions of lives and is still raging in many parts of the world. Nevertheless, our recovery efforts have begun. and we must guide this in a manner which is conducive to fight against climate change and assure sustainable growth. Italy has earmarked 40% of the funds in our national recovery plan to the ecological transition. We aim to increase the share of renewable sources in our energy mix, make mobility more sustainable, improve the energy efficiency of our buildings, and safeguard biodiversity. This is the type of concrete action each of our countries can take to recover better. We are therefore working with our G20 partners to each commit an ambitious share of our recovery plans towards transforming our economies and pursuing a greener and more inclusive growth model. With the G20, while the G20 does not reflect all views, it is a large and diverse group whose discussions are broadly in line with the overall climate discourse. A strong resolve by the G20 will therefore be instrumental to a successful COP26 in Glasgow. This implies committing to keeping 1.5 Celsius within reach and developing strategies that are consistent with this goal. Sharing these common objectives will be crucial in sustaining a real green recovery. Ambitious pledges from many countries are already generating a virtuous race to the top, which is our only chance to counter this global threat. Credible national and international targets are key, and also make it clear to non-state actors that the change is irreversible. This will help to mobilize further ambition and unlock the vast potential for action within the private sector, as Bill Thomas was rightly stressing. Our collective success ultimately depends on this. I thank you very much for your effort, for your engagement, and also for your contribution to the success of the G20. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Luigi Mattiolo, for taking the time. We know you're in the midst of the preparatory work for the G20, so I imagine that there's plenty to do for you, and we wish success to the Italian G20 at the end of the month. Thanks again to our panelists, Bill Thomas and Camilla Bausch. So it was a pleasure having you for this important discussion. And now, as I see them in the room, there's no margin for error, because now I can leave the floor to Ambassador Giampiero Massola, who's president of ISPI, and his guest, who's Angel Gurria, former Secretary General at the OECD. Thank you.